Hello everybody. In today's tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how we can use combination of process builder and a flow to take care of updating your record when it cannot be done alone by process builder. I'm going to show you an example and we're going to do it together with the flow. So usually, let me pull up my record and I'll explain you the scenario. So this is a claim record which is updated from some third-party data service, and it's a nightly feed which comes in. Uh, Here I want to walk you through this part right here. So what happens is whenever a claim is submitted, there is an employee ID field which is populated with the data input itself. It could be either entering the data or anybody else. The employee ID gets populated when the record is created. But so there is another field called injured employee, which is a lookup field. Now, what we want to do is anytime this record is created and there is an employee ID, this should get populated by a lookup field, which meaning there is an employee object here. If I go to my setup, I'll show you the employee object. By the way, this is a custom, this is a Google Chrome extension, which lets you search for objects much faster. So I have an employee object itself, and that's where that object is looked up. Here we have a field called employee ID. If I search for that, so there is a employee ID field, employee ID. So what I mean by that is anytime a claim record is updated or created, what should happen is either my trigger or flow should basically look up all the records, right? And wherever any record, if it finds an employee record with this employee ID, so this employee ID is not the Salesforce ID, this is just an external identifier. So this employee ID, anytime Salesforce finds that records in an employee record, it will populate this value with that Salesforce ID here. Now, the reason we cannot do it using just a process builder is because a process builder does not have a search functionality. So you won't be able to search. Yes, process builder can update record by looking other records, like you can apply different function, you could use different functions, and you could update fields using process builder, but it will not necessarily search for the employee ID. So in order for us to search the employee ID, you have two options. Either A, you can build a trigger, and the trigger you can use the SOQL function and pass the IDs and look for the employee ID, make a map of employee ID with employee records, and then update it that way, right? But now we're looking at more point and click than coding. So there is another way you can use a flow process. So let's see how we can use flow process. I already have one built, but I am going to be building one from scratch just for this demo purpose. So let's open a flow. New flow. And I'm gonna say, oops, yeah, you need Adobe Flash. All right, there we are. So how does the flow works? Let me walk you through the different components. If you have not used flow, I'm planning on a tutorial like for basic flows. But here are all the different resources you have, or I would say palette. So this is like your palette, right? So we're looking at this part, data. There is record create, record lookup, record update, delete, fast create, fast update, fast lookup, and all various stuff here. So all right, let's imagine how this should work, right? First, let's go back to our claim record. Now, the way it should work is whenever. Now, why am I creating the flow is because I'm going to call the flow from our process builder. All right. So what should happen is the process builder will already have this claim ID right here. So the process builder will already have this claim ID. Now the process builder will pass this claim ID to the flow. And now the flow can look up the employee ID and search for that employee record. All right. So what we need to do is use a record lookup element, right? Because we are looking up for records. So let's give it a name, search, or I'm going to say lookup employee. And I am looking for employee records. And that is a custom object. There it is. So you see here, we have lookup employee that meets the following criteria. All right. Now, what does that mean? It could look up for so many employee records. How are we defining what employee record does this flow wants? Now that means we already know that this claim will have a employee ID field, right? So we should look up for employee ID. Now this field is on employee record because whatever you select here, those are the fields it's going to show up. It's not going to, so it will only show up the fields which belong to that object. All right. So these are all the objects, this employee object fields here. So we are saying that search me an employee record which has this field. Now, how does the flow knows what's the ID? Because we haven't defined it yet. Now we need to create a new variable. All right. So let's create a new variable, and we're gonna say employee ID, set text type, and I'm gonna say input and output. Okay. So we created a lookup. So we're saying lookup for the employee records that meets this criteria. And after looking up, assign the records fields to variables to reference them in your flow. To variables. Now this record field, meaning employee ID, we are assigning it to one of the, we are going to create a flow variable here. The reason we are creating this flow variable is because we want to store that employee ID, the Salesforce ID, in a flow variable, and then we update it in the next step. So I'm going to say employee lookup ID. When I say lookup ID, meaning it's the Salesforce standard 18-digit ID. And I'm going to say input and output. Be very careful when it is not input and output. If it is just private, sometimes you might not be able to get that value. So you might put private, but I always prefer putting it to input and output. So I'm going to hit OK. I'm also going to say sign null value. It's good to have this because sometimes the flow might fail if it doesn't find any records. So let's hit OK. So that's our record lookup. Now, after we look up, so we looked up the employee record, we have the employee ID, lookup ID. Now, what we need to do is update that claim. That's what is our main purpose. So update claim. And now we look for the reason we are here, because we want to update the claim record. So that's the field, that's the object, right? So now update claim that meets the following criteria. What could be the criteria? Well, the criteria 1 is obviously the claim ID, because if we don't have this criteria, what's going to happen is it's going to update all the claim records. We don't want that. So we are going to say update the claim record whose ID is equal to the ID which the process builder is going to pass, which meaning we need to create another variable called claim ID. If it is input and output, that's when the process builder will be able to pass the value here. If it is private, the process builder can't find this ID. So that's the difference. And we say claim ID, and now we are saying update the record fields with variable, constant, input, or other values. We can add one more field here. We don't need to, but we can still add this just for demo purpose. We can still also add not only the same claim, but if the claim has, so now there is a field called employee ID on the claim, this field. We're also saying if the claim ID is equal to whatever is passed, and also the employee ID is equal to, what will that be? You guessed it right, that will be the employee ID which we are passing. So those are our conditions to update. Now what are we updating? So this is our main concern here. That's why we are here. So we are going to update the claim injured employee. Oops. I think on the back end, the field name is not injured employee. It's called claimant I believe. So actually, let's go to the object itself and make sure that that's the right field we are looking at. Bear with me here. Claim. And then we go to, we're looking for injured employee. Alright, so that's called claimant lookup. I'm going to just copy this. And I'm going to just paste it right here. Alright, there it is. So claimant lookup. And what will that be equal to? So in the first step, we already found the employee ID, and then we assigned the employee ID, the Salesforce ID, to a variable called employee lookup ID. I spelled it wrong, but so that's the field, employee lookup ID. That's the field we are going to assign the value to. And hit OK. Don't forget to connect these two. And this is our flow starting point. And then we save it. Save it as update claim employee. As a side note, please always make sure when you're working on an org, you put your name, and the date you have. What's the date today? December 10, 2017. Always make sure you make this habit of updating the. So what this description always helps, because somebody else who comes to your org and try to find, if there's no description, it becomes really hard for the other person, and even yourself, when you look at it after a few days, you might forget. So it's always a good idea to date it. And yes, sometimes Salesforce already dates it, but I like it this way, because now somebody else updates it, he or she is going to write their name. So updating the claim record with injured employee ID, which will be called by flow. Oh, sorry, called by process builder. We haven't built a process builder yet. So that's it. And then we hit OK, and we are going to now activate the flow so that it's accessible by the process builder. Close it. Unless you activate it, you can't find it in the process builder. So activate it like that. I already have a process builder. For this tutorial, I'm not going to create the process builder, but I'm going to walk you through it. So of course we start from the claim object, right? And then it's a good idea to, if you know that your records might get updated, it's a good idea to have it on created or edited depending upon your requirement. So for this specific purpose, I chose when a record is created or edited. We don't need this. And then the next step in the process builder is always to define the criteria, like to make sure that this process builder doesn't fire for every claim record updated, right? There might be certain conditions you might need to meet, because it's a bad idea to not have any conditions, because what happens is then the process builder is going to fire for every claim, every object, or every record update or creation, so which will affect your speed. So that's why it's a good idea always to have certain conditions based upon your business requirements. In my condition, and also this is very important, whenever you are updating anything with process builder, regardless of you're calling a calling a flow or not, if you're just updating anything based on certain conditions, make sure that that field is not null, because what's going to happen is if you do not take care of this, if you don't say claim.employee ID is not null, the process builder is gonna try to find it, try to update it, and what's gonna happen is finally it will send you an error saying that null cannot be assigned or something like that. You're gonna get a null pointer exception, just like trigger. So it's a good idea always to be safe, and whatever record you will be looking for or you'll be updating on your action, make sure you check for that record. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm checking that employee ID should not be null, because that's our whole criteria, right? If it is null, the flow can't get that value. And this is just my business requirement where this should only be valid for, there is a certain pick list value. I'm checking on that, and that's it. And this is where the fun part is, without writing a trigger. So what's gonna happen is, once it loads, yeah. So when you are here, you can name it, and the flow process, any flow on your, whatever flows you have in your R will be shown up here. So you start typing UPD and that will appear here, all right? And this is the important part here. Now set flow variables. So whenever you start typing this, you will notice employee ID will be there, because this is our variable in the flow. Claim ID is a variable in the flow, and if you remember, we made it input and output, so that's why the process builder can access it. And then we do the field reference type, and then assign, because the employee ID needs the employee ID field and the claim ID needs claim ID field. That's how we assign it. Easy enough. Let me show you how it actually looks. I'm going to clone this process and just going to save it. I'll delete it later. But so this is how it looks. Add action, select one. We're going to have all flows. Then I'm going to say update update injured something, and here is where all the flows are going to be. So update, see, here it is, and set flow variables, that's where you add the rows. Now if I start typing employee ID, boom, you see it there, and then the field reference, and it's pretty straightforward. You just look for employee ID here, and it's gonna find it for you. Employee ID, choose it, and then you go for the claim ID. That was our another variable we needed, and then we look for ID, which is claim ID. That's a record ID, so it's not a record type ID, record ID. So, and then you save it, and once you save it and activate it, you'll be able to test out the process. So that was solid, and yes, I took a condition or a business requirement which I had and showed it to you, but feel free to modify it according to your business need. You might need to search for some values and update your records in that way. I know with Trigger it is a lot easier in terms, because if you are used to using Trigger, it's very easier. You just write a query and update it. Flow, if you haven't used it before, it might get, I know I had difficulty using the flow for the first time, but I just wanted to give it a try, and once I was successful, I wanted to share it with you all, so you are able to get help from that. I hope you enjoyed this, and feel free to drop questions if you are trying to solve some issue at your org. Thank you so much for watching.